A queen should not beg. A queen should not kneel. And yet, here she was, standing at the mercy of a human man who held her fate in his hands. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and smoke, a stark contrast to the perfumed halls of her fallen kingdom. Queen Seraphina had never imagined she would find herself in a place like this, far from the opulent towers of her home, exiled to a desolate human settlement where the very name of her race was met with hatred and fear. She clutched the tattered remains of her cloak, hiding the faint glow of her iridescent skin. Though she had tried to mask her true nature, her otherworldly features remained impossible to conceal entirely. She knew that humans were suspicious creatures. If they discovered who she truly was, survival would become an even more impossible feat than it already seemed. The man before her, Callum Graves, leaned against the wooden counter of the dimly lit inn, arms crossed over his broad chest. His sharp eyes assessed her with a mixture of caution and curiosity. He had seen his fair share of desperate souls wander through his doors, but never a woman like her. "You want a place to stay?" Callum's voice was gruff, skepticism laced in every syllable. "You don't look like you have coin. And I don't run a charity." Seraphina's jaw tightened. She had been a ruler once, a queen with power and influence. Now, she was nothing more than a fugitive. A refugee. But she could not afford to let pride dictate her actions. "I can work," she said, her voice steady despite the weight of humiliation pressing against her ribs. "I can earn my keep." Callum exhaled slowly, rubbing his jaw. "And what exactly can you do?" She hesitated. What skills did she possess that a human would find valuable? She had been trained in diplomacy, strategy, and warfare, none of which would serve her here. She had never so much as lifted a bucket of water in her own palace, and yet, if she wanted to survive, she would have to learn. Fast. "Anything you need," she finally said. "I'm a fast learner." He studied her for a long moment before shaking his head. "Fine. The stables need tending. You can start there. You mess up, you're out." "Understood." Seraphina swallowed hard. She had faced executioners, betrayal, and the collapse of her empire, but somehow, the thought of shoveling filth in a human stable felt like a new form of humiliation. And yet, she had no choice. "Understood," she murmured. The work was grueling. Her fingers, unaccustomed to hard labor, blistered within hours. The stench of the stables clung to her, filling her nostrils with an unrelenting assault of earth, sweat, and animal musk. Each movement sent a jolt of pain through muscles she had never needed to use before. But she endured. She had to. Days passed in a blur of toil and exhaustion. Callum rarely spoke to her beyond giving orders, though his watchful eyes followed her every move. He was trying to understand her, to figure out what she was hiding. She could not afford to let him see too much. One evening, as she finished brushing down a particularly stubborn mare, she felt his presence before she heard him. "You're not from around here," Callum remarked, leaning against the wooden beam of the stable entrance. Seraphina stiffened, keeping her focus on the horse. "Neither are many who end up here." "True," he admitted. "But most don't carry themselves like royalty." Her breath hitched, but she willed herself to remain calm. "Is that what you think I am? Royalty? I think you're running from something. And whatever it is, you're not used to being on the losing side." A bitter smile touched her lips. "Perceptive. It's my job to be." He pushed off the beam, stepping closer. "If trouble follows you, it becomes my problem too. And I don't like problems." She turned to face him fully, her tired eyes meeting his. Then perhaps you should have left me to die in the cold. Something flickered in his gaze, an emotion she could not quite name. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be worse. As he walked away, Serafina watched him, uncertainty curling in her stomach. He was dangerous not because he wielded a sword, but because he saw too much. She could not afford to let him see her weakness. But what choice did she have? In this new world, survival meant sacrifice. And she had already lost everything. As she settled into the pile of hay that served as her makeshift bed, she whispered a silent vow to herself. I will not break. Survival was a battle of endurance, not just of the body, but of the spirit. And Serafina was losing both. The days in a human settlement stretched into an unrelenting cycle of toil and silence. Every morning, Serafina woke to the chill of the barn, her muscles aching from the previous day's labor. Callum was a man of few words, but his watchful gaze never strayed far. He didn't trust her. She could feel it in the way he measured every movement she made, every answer she gave. And she could not blame him. Her hands, once soft and unblemished, were now calloused and rough. The pain in her body was nothing compared to the humiliation of her circumstances. She had been a queen, revered and feared in equal measure. Now, she was nothing more than a stable hand, shoveling filth, and hauling feed for creatures who had more freedom than she did. But she endured. She had no other choice. One evening, as the last rays of sunlight bled across the sky, Callum called her name. She turned, brushing stray strands of silver hair from her damp forehead. He stood by the inn's back door, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Come inside, he said. There's something you need to see. Unease coiled in her stomach, but she followed. The inn's main room was warm, filled with the scent of burning wood and spiced ale. A handful of men sat at wooden tables, their voices low but watchful as she passed. Even after days of working among them, she was still an outsider. Callum led her to a small side chamber, closing the door behind them. On the table before him lay a sheet of parchment, its edges curling from the heat of the nearby lantern. Serafina's breath caught as she saw the inked words. A bounty notice. For her. Her own face stared back at her, the lines of her features unmistakable despite the crude rendering. The sum offered for her capture was enough to make any man reconsider his morals. This was posted in the market this morning, Callum said, his voice low. Serafina forced herself to meet his gaze. And yet, I am still standing here? For now. His jaw tightened. But I need to know what I'm dealing with. Who exactly are you running from? She hesitated. The truth was a dangerous thing. But Callum was no fool. If she did not give him something, he might decide that turning her in was a more profitable arrangement. I was once a queen, she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. My people were betrayed. My kingdom fell. And those who took it from me will not rest until I am dead. A flicker of something understanding, perhaps passed through Callum's eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it came. You should leave, he said after a long pause. Find somewhere else to hide before the wrong person sees this. Serafina's hands curled into fists at her sides. And where would I go? The whole world has turned against my kind. If I leave, I die. If I stay, I risk dragging you into my war. Callum exhaled, raking a hand through his dark hair. Then you have a choice to make, Your Majesty. Stay and fight, or run and hope they never find you. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. I stopped believing in hope a long time ago. Their eyes locked, and for the first time since she had arrived, Seraphina saw something other than suspicion in his gaze. He had lost things, too. She could see it in the shadows that lined his face, in the way his fingers clenched as if grasping at something long gone. He understood her. More than he wanted to. A knock at the door shattered the moment. Callum tensed. Without a word, he snatched the parchment from the table and shoved it into the flickering lantern's flame. The fire devoured it, turning her bounty to ash. "Get back to the barn," he ordered. "And keep your head down." Seraphina hesitated. "Why are you helping me?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he opened the door just enough to see who was outside before stepping back, clearing a path for her. "Because I know what it means to lose everything. And if you're telling the truth, you deserve a chance to take it back." She nodded once, then slipped past him into the shadows. As she stepped out into the cold night air, she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in a long time. Not hope, but the faintest whisper of possibility. Arya stood at the edge of the riverbank, the gentle hum of the forest surrounding her. The early morning mist clung to her blue skin, and the cold water lapping at her feet was a stark reminder of the uncertain path ahead. She had spent the past few days recovering, regaining her strength, and learning more about the human settlement she was now forced to coexist with. But one truth was undeniable: her fate was no longer her own. Gavin watched her from a distance, his arms crossed over his chest. She was unlike anyone he had ever met: regal, intelligent, yet vulnerable in a way that made him uneasy. He had taken a risk bringing her here, but the question lingered: was she worth that risk? "You're up early," he said finally, stepping closer. Arya turned, her silver eyes meeting his. "I find it difficult to sleep when uncertainty weighs on my mind." Gavin sighed. "That makes two of us." He gestured for her to follow him back toward the cabin. She hesitated for a moment before complying. The dirt path beneath her feet was soft from last night's rain, and as they walked, Gavin spoke. "I've been thinking about your situation. The people in town, most of them won't take kindly to an outsider, let alone an alien queen. But if you want to survive here, you need to blend in." Arya raised an eyebrow. "And how do you suggest I do that?" Gavin smirked. "For starters, you'll need to change out of those royal-looking clothes. And you'll need to work." "Work?" She frowned. "I was trained to rule, not to labor." He scoffed. "Well, out here, everyone pulls their weight. If you want to stay, you have to earn your place." Arya clenched her jaw but nodded. She had no choice. The alternative was far worse. The day was long and grueling. Gavin had her chopping firewood, fetching water, and tending to the small garden behind the cabin. It was humiliating, exhausting, and utterly beneath her, or at least, that's what she kept telling herself. But as the hours passed, she found herself adapting, her body growing stronger with each task. At midday, Gavin called for a break. He handed her a piece of bread and a small bowl of stew. She eyed it warily before taking a bite. "You're doing better than I expected," he admitted, sitting across from her. Arya wiped sweat from her brow. "I do not enjoy this, but I understand its necessity." He chuckled. "That's the spirit." For the first time since she had arrived, there was a moment of peace between them. But it was short-lived. A distant sound broke the quiet, a deep, guttural growl that sent shivers down Arya's spine. Gavin stiffened, his eyes darting toward the tree line. "Get inside," he ordered. Arya stood, her muscles tensing. "What is it?" He didn't answer, instead grabbing his rifle and moving toward the trees. Arya hesitated for only a moment before following. Her instincts screamed at her to be cautious, but she needed to see what danger lurked beyond the safety of the cabin. Through the foliage, she caught sight of a large, shadowy figure moving between the trees. It was unlike anything she had ever seen on her own world, four-legged, with a thick, muscular frame and glowing red eyes. It was hunting. Gavin took a slow breath. Damn it! A night beast. Arya's heart pounded. A what? Predator. Strong, fast, and mean as hell. The creature snarled, stepping into the clearing. Its fur was matted with dirt, its fangs bared as it sniffed the air. Gavin lifted his rifle, aiming carefully. Don't move! Arya, however, had other plans. In a fluid motion, she reached down, grabbing a large branch from the ground. If she was going to prove her worth, it wouldn't be by hiding. She stepped forward, meeting the beast's gaze. The creature growled, lowering its body, ready to pounce. Gavin cursed under his breath. What the hell are you doing? Arya's voice was steady. Earning my place. And with that, the fight began. The night beast lunged, a blur of muscle and fury. Arya barely had time to react before the creature was upon her, its massive claws swiping through the air. She ducked, rolling to the side as the beast's talons gouged deep furrows into the ground where she had stood moments before. Gavin swore and raised his rifle, but Arya was already moving. Her instincts, honed by years of royal combat training, took over. Though she had never faced a creature like this before, battle was woven into her bloodline. She swung the branch with all her strength, striking the beast across the snout. It snarled in rage, shaking its head and baring its jagged teeth. Get back! Gavin barked, firing a shot that barely grazed the beast's flank. The bullet only seemed to enrage it further. I can handle this, Arya shot back, her grip tightening on the makeshift weapon. The beast charged again. This time, she sidestepped and drove the branch into its ribs, using its own momentum against it. The impact sent a shock through her arms, but the beast stumbled, giving her the opening she needed. Gavin took the opportunity and fired again, this time landing a shot to the creature's shoulder. It howled in pain, staggering backward. Arya didn't hesitate. She leaped forward, slamming the branch against its wounded limb. The creature collapsed with a final, agonized cry before its body went still. Breathing heavily, Arya stepped back, her heart pounding. She turned to Gavin, who lowered his rifle, staring at her in disbelief. That, he said, exhaling sharply, was reckless. Arya straightened. That was necessary. Their eyes met, and for a moment, there was something unspoken between them. Then Gavin shook his head. Come on. We need to burn the body before more show up. By the time they finished disposing of the night beast, the sun had begun to dip below the horizon. The two of them sat near the fire outside the cabin, the crackling flames casting flickering shadows against the trees. Arya stared into the embers, exhaustion settling into her bones. Gavin handed her a flask. Here. It'll help. She took a tentative sip, wincing at the burn of the liquid. What is this? Whiskey. You don't have alcohol where you're from. We do. It's just different. She took another sip, letting the warmth spread through her. Why did you help me? Gavin shrugged. Because leaving you out there would have been wrong. Arya studied him. You risked a lot. You continue to. Yeah, well, he muttered, running a hand through his hair, I guess I have a bad habit of doing stupid things. She smirked. That makes two of us. For the first time, Gavin chuckled. It was a small moment of peace, a fragile truce between two people from vastly different worlds. But as the fire crackled and the wind whispered through the trees, Arya knew one thing for certain: her battle was far from over. And neither was his. The morning air was crisp as Arya stood at the edge of the forest, the weight of last night's battle still heavy in her muscles. The events replayed in her mind: the night beast's furious charge, the adrenaline coursing through her veins, and the moment she and Gavin stood over its lifeless body. She had proven her worth, but at what cost? Gavin emerged from the cabin, his usual guarded expression softer than before. He carried 2 cups of steaming liquid and handed one to her. "Coffee," he said simply. She took a cautious sip, the bitter taste foreign but oddly comforting. "Stronger than what I'm used to?" He smirked. "You'll get used to it." A comfortable silence settled between them, but it was soon interrupted by the distant sound of voices. Gavin stiffened, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Company," he muttered, setting his cup down. "Stay inside." Arya bristled at the command. "I can handle myself." "I know," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "But these aren't night beasts. These are people. And people are far more dangerous." A group of 3 men approached the clearing, their boots crunching against the dirt. They were rugged, dressed in worn-out clothes, and carried weapons strapped to their belts. The leader, a man with a thick beard and calculating eyes, stopped a few feet from Gavin. "Didn't think I'd see you again, Gavin," the man drawled. "Figured you'd be long gone." "Dale," Gavin greeted coolly. "What do you want?" Dale's gaze flickered toward the cabin. "Word's going around that you've been harboring someone. An outsider." Gavin's jaw tightened. "And?" Dale smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "And that's dangerous. You know how folks around here feel about strangers." Inside the cabin, Arya listened, her hands clenching into fists. She knew this was coming. The moment she had arrived, she had upset the balance of this world. Humans feared the unknown, and she was the ultimate unknown. Gavin didn't flinch. "She's not a threat." Dale chuckled. "Maybe not yet. But the council won't see it that way. You've got a choice, Gavin. Hand her over, or deal with the consequences." Silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Then Gavin spoke, his voice low and steady. "I don't take kindly to threats, Dale." The other man's eyes darkened. "Suit yourself. But don't say I didn't warn you." With that, he turned and walked away, his men following. Gavin watched them disappear into the trees before exhaling sharply. Arya stepped outside. "They won't stop, will they?" "No," Gavin admitted. "They'll be back. And next time, they won't be asking." As night fell, Arya sat by the fire, her mind racing. She had expected resistance, but not so soon. Not so openly. Gavin was risking everything for her. "Why?" She turned to him. "You could have given me up." Gavin met her gaze. "I don't betray people." She studied him, searching for deception but finding none. "You're a rare kind of human." He smirked. "I'll take that as a compliment." A sudden howl echoed in the distance, sending a chill down Arya's spine. The threats around them were growing. But the greatest danger wasn't the beasts lurking in the woods. It was the humans who feared her existence. And they were coming. The night was thick with silence, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves as the wind whispered through the towering trees. Inside the small wooden cabin, Selene sat across from Orion, her violet eyes locked onto his as she processed his latest revelation. "I know what I'm asking of you is dangerous," Orion admitted, his voice low. "But I need to know if I can trust you." Selene exhaled sharply. Trust. A fragile word, easily broken, rarely mended. Her past had taught her that trust was a currency too valuable to spend carelessly. And yet, here she was, contemplating whether to risk everything for a man she barely knew. Orion studied her expression, searching for any hint of doubt. He had spent enough time in the war-torn galaxy to recognize hesitation when he saw it. The Queen was strong, but her eyes carried a storm he couldn't quite decipher. "Tell me the truth," she finally said, her voice steady. "What exactly do you need me for?" Orion leaned back against the chair, his fingers drumming against the wooden surface of the table. "There's a council of leaders who have been conspiring against your people. They control key resources, influence trade routes, and they've been funding rebel groups to keep your empire destabilized. I need your insight to expose them." Selene clenched her jaw. "Why should I help you? If I reveal what I know, I will become an even bigger target than I already am." "Because they won't stop with your exile," Orion replied firmly. "They'll hunt you down, silence you, and destroy anyone who stands in their way. Including me." A heavy silence fell between them. Selene wanted to believe that Orion's intentions were pure, that he truly sought justice rather than personal gain. But experience had taught her to be wary of men who spoke of noble causes. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. "If I agree to help you, I have conditions." Orion raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." "First," she began, "you must swear that my people will not suffer any more because of this. I won't be used as a pawn in another political game." Orion nodded. "I swear it." "Second," she continued, "if we uncover the truth, I want a chance to confront them myself." Orion hesitated. "That's dangerous." "So is trusting you." A smirk played at the corner of his lips. "Fair enough." Selene leaned back, considering her next words carefully. "Then I suppose we have an agreement." A flicker of relief crossed Orion's face, but it was quickly replaced by something more serious. "Then we need to leave at first light. There's someone we need to meet, someone who has information that could change everything." Selene frowned. "Who?" Orion's gaze darkened. "A former ally of your father?" Dawn broke over the forest, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. Selene and Orion rode in silence, their horses cutting through the damp underbrush as they traveled deeper into unknown territory. The air was thick with the scent of pine, and the distant sound of a river hinted at a hidden path ahead. They reached a secluded clearing by midday, where an old stone structure stood, half hidden beneath vines and decay. Orion dismounted first, scanning the area cautiously before nodding to Selene. "Stay close," he murmured. She followed him inside, her senses on high alert. The interior was dimly lit, the air stale with the scent of damp stone and forgotten memories. At the far end of the room, a figure stood waiting. A man stepped forward, his silver hair glinting in the light. His piercing gaze settled on Selene, and for a moment, she felt an unspoken recognition. "It's been a long time," he said, his voice laced with regret. "You have your father's eyes." Selene's breath caught in her throat. "You knew him?" The man nodded. "I fought beside him. And I betrayed him." Orion stiffened beside her, but Selene raised a hand, signaling him to stay silent. Why should I trust anything you say? She demanded. The man sighed. Because I'm the only one who can help you expose the truth. Selene clenched her fists. Every instinct screamed at her to walk away. But deep down, she knew sometimes, the only way to move forward was to face the ghosts of the past. Orion placed a hand on her shoulder. It's your choice, Selene. She took a slow, steady breath before turning back to the man. Then start talking. The air inside the old stone structure was thick with the scent of mildew and time. Shadows flickered along the damp walls as the dim light from the narrow windows struggled to illuminate the space. Selene's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the silver-haired man before her. His gaze was unreadable, but beneath the calm surface, she sensed the weight of regret. You said you fought beside my father, Selene said, her voice steady despite the turmoil within her. And that you betrayed him. The man nodded slowly, his expression darkening. My name is Kale Varen. Once, I was your father's most trusted strategist. Until I was forced to choose between his life and the survival of our people. Selene's jaw tightened. And you chose to let him die? Kale didn't flinch. I chose to prevent a massacre. But it cost me my honor and your father's trust. Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken accusations. Orion shifted beside her, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his weapon. We don't have time for old grievances. Kale, if you truly want to atone, tell us what you know. Kale let out a slow breath. The council that exiled you, Selene, is not just a governing body. They are a syndicate, controlling the balance of power behind the scenes. They use chaos to manipulate trade, economies, and entire civilizations. Your father discovered their true nature and they silenced him before he could act. Selene clenched her fists. And now they want to ensure I never reclaim my throne. Kale nodded. They have been tracking your movements since your exile. But something has changed. They are no longer content with keeping you in the shadows. They want you dead. A chill ran down Selene's spine. Why now? Kale hesitated, then turned to a battered wooden chest at the corner of the room. He knelt, unfastening the rusted latch, and retrieved a small metallic device. He placed it on the table between them. Because they know you are close to uncovering something that could destroy them. This contains records of the Council's hidden dealings. Trade routes, secret alliances, assassination orders including the one that sealed your fate. Selene reached for the device, but Kale placed a firm hand over it. There's a problem. The data is encrypted. Only someone with access to the Council's network can decode it. Orion frowned. Then we need to find someone who can. Kale met his gaze. There is only one person who can decrypt this data. A former Council informant, someone who disappeared years ago, fearing for their life. If they are still alive, they are hiding in the capital under a new identity. Selene took a deep breath. Then that's where we go next. The journey to the capital was long and perilous. They traveled under the cover of darkness, evading patrols and bypassing heavily guarded checkpoints. Selene felt the weight of every step, the burden of her past and the uncertain future pressing down on her shoulders. As they reached the outskirts of the city, Orion motioned for them to stop. We can't just walk in. The moment they recognize you, we're as good as dead. Kale nodded. I know a way inside. But it will require disguises. And absolute trust. Selene glanced between the two men. She had come too far to turn back now. Then let's do it. The night loomed ahead, full of danger and uncertainty. But for the first time in a long time, Selene felt a spark of something she had lost. Hope. The capital city loomed before them, its towering spires gleaming beneath the pale moonlight. From their vantage point on the outskirts, Selene could see the movement of patrols along the perimeter walls. Security had tightened since her exile, undoubtedly a direct response to the council's growing paranoia. Cale crouched beside her, his keen eyes scanning the streets below. "We'll have to move quickly. There are informants everywhere." Orion adjusted the hood of his cloak, his expression grim. "We're walking straight into their stronghold. If they catch even a whisper of your presence, Selene, it's over." Selene nodded. Fear coiled in her chest, but she forced it down. She had come too far to falter now. They entered the city under the cover of darkness, blending into the throngs of merchants and travelers arriving at the outer gates. Cale led them through narrow alleys, weaving through the shadows with practiced ease. Every step felt like a gamble, every turn a potential trap. At last, they reached a secluded safe house nestled between two crumbling buildings. The door creaked as Cale pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit interior cluttered with old furniture and faded maps pinned to the walls. A figure stood in the far corner, their face hidden beneath the hood. "You're late," the stranger murmured. Selene tensed. "You knew we were coming." The figure lowered their hood, revealing a sharp-eyed woman with dark auburn hair. "I know many things. The council has been searching for you, Selene. You're running out of time." Cale exhaled, his voice taut. "We need your help, Erin." Erin's lips quirked into a wry smile. "I never thought I'd see the day when Cale Varen came knocking on my door." Selene stepped forward. "You were an informant for the council. Cale says you can decrypt this." She placed the encrypted device on the table between them. Erin eyed it warily. "If I do this, I become a target." "You already are," Orion said. "They'll never let you stay hidden forever." Erin hesitated, then sighed. "Fine. But if we do this, you'll need to buy me time. The council's spies are everywhere. If they catch wind of what I'm doing, we won't live long enough to see the truth exposed." The plan was set. Erin worked tirelessly to crack the encryption while Selene, Orion, and Cale spread false leads across the city, drawing attention away from the safe house. But the council's grip was suffocating. No matter how careful they were, Selene could feel the walls closing in. On the third night, Orion returned from a scouting mission, his face tense. "They know." Selene's blood ran cold. "How?" "Doesn't matter." Cale checked his weapons. "We need to move." Erin's fingers flew over the console. "I'm almost there, just a few more minutes." They didn't have a few minutes. A sharp knock echoed through the room. Then another. Then silence. Selene met Orion's gaze. They were out of time. The flickering flames of the torches cast long shadows across the cold stone walls of the abandoned fortress. Seraphina stood at the center of the great hall, her sapphire skin glowing under the dim light. Across from her, Commander Varen's piercing gaze bore into her, filled with unspoken questions and hidden calculations. The alliance had been formed, but the weight of its consequences had only begun to settle. "You do not trust me," Seraphina stated, breaking the heavy silence. Her voice was calm, yet there was an unmistakable steel beneath it. Varen crossed his arms, his posture rigid. "Trust is earned, not given freely. You have much to prove, Your Majesty." She tilted her chin upward, her royal demeanor unwavering despite the circumstances. "And I will prove it," she declared. "But time is not our ally. The Emperor's forces march even as we speak. If we do not act swiftly, we will all be nothing but ash beneath his heel. The room fell into a tense silence. The gathered rebels and warriors exchanged uneasy glances. They had spent years resisting the Empire's cruelty, yet the idea of following an exiled queen into battle was no easy choice. It was Magnus who finally spoke. "We have fought battles before, but never against the Emperor himself." His voice carried the weight of a seasoned warrior. "What do you propose, Serafina?" She took a deep breath, her mind racing through every possibility, every strategy she had devised over the past weeks. The Emperor's forces were vast and disciplined. A direct confrontation would be suicide. They needed something unexpected. "A diversion," she said firmly. "We draw his forces away, weaken his stronghold before we strike." Varen frowned. "You want to divide his army?" She nodded. "We target his supply lines. His weapons, food, reinforcements. If we cripple his ability to sustain war, we stand a chance." There was a murmur among the warriors. It was risky, but not impossible. The Emperor's power rested in his army's strength. If that was stripped away, his rule would weaken. One of the younger rebels, a fierce woman named Illyra, stepped forward. "It could work. The Emperor's forces rely on precise logistics. If we sever the connections between his battalions, he will falter." Varen's expression remained unreadable, but there was a spark of consideration in his eyes. "And how do you propose we strike?" Serafina took a step forward. "We divide our forces into 3 groups. One will target the supply lines, the second will create distractions along the outer villages to keep the soldiers occupied. The third, the strongest, will infiltrate the Imperial city." A hush fell over the hall. "Infiltrate the Imperial city?" Magnus echoed, his tone skeptical. "That is madness." "It is the only way," Serafina insisted. "I know the city. I know its weaknesses. If we strike at the heart of the Emperor's power, we force him to fight on our terms." The debate raged on for hours. Voices rose in dissent, others in support. But as the night wore on, the plan solidified. There was no other choice. The war had reached its peak. Victory or annihilation, there would be no turning back. As the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the fortress walls, Varen approached Serafina. "You are braver than I gave you credit for," he admitted. "Or perhaps just more desperate." She gave a small, tired smile. "Perhaps both." He extended his hand. "Then let's see this through." She clasped his arm, sealing their pact. The war for the throne had begun in earnest. The Imperial city stood silent in the eerie glow of dawn, a hush of anticipation before the storm. Serafina adjusted the hood of her cloak as she and her small team navigated the labyrinthine alleys, the weight of their mission pressing down upon them. Varen walked beside her, his usual stoicism replaced with a determined edge. They had come too far to falter now. The diversionary attacks had worked. Fires burned in the outskirts, and the distant clash of steel echoed through the air. The Emperor's forces scrambled to respond, leaving the palace defenses weakened just as Serafina had planned. But she knew the true battle would be fought in the throne room, where the Emperor awaited. Magnus, leading the strike force, placed a firm hand on Serafina's shoulder. "We do this together," he said. "No matter what happens." She nodded, her resolve unwavering. They pushed forward, dispatching scattered guards with swift efficiency. Every step closer to the palace felt heavier, the weight of destiny pressing upon Serafina's shoulders. This was it. The grand doors of the throne room loomed before them, unguarded but imposing. Varen stepped forward, testing the handle. Unlocked. A trap. With a shared glance, they moved as one. The doors swung open, revealing the Emperor seated upon his gilded throne, clad in black and gold. His cold, calculating eyes met Seraphina's, and a slow smile curved his lips. So, he mused, the exiled queen dares to return? Seraphina stepped forward, throwing back her hood. Your reign ends today. The Emperor rose, unfazed. You have grown bold in your exile, he said, his voice smooth as silk. But you are still the frightened girl I cast aside. The air grew heavy with tension. Then, in a blur of motion, the Emperor unleashed his power. Dark energy crackled from his fingertips, striking the ground where Seraphina had stood moments before. She rolled aside, drawing her blade. The battle erupted. Varen and Magnus charged forward, their weapons meeting the Emperor's guards in a deadly dance. Seraphina darted through the chaos, her focus solely on the man who had stolen everything from her. Their blades clashed, sparks flying as steel met steel. He was powerful far more than she had remembered. Every strike she delivered was met with an equal and opposite force. But she had something he did not: purpose. The years of suffering, of exile, had honed her into something stronger. The fight raged, and slowly, Seraphina began to gain the upper hand. She feinted left, drawing him into a trap, then struck her blade sinking into his side. The Emperor staggered, shock flickering across his face. You, he gasped, blood staining his robes. Seraphina stepped closer, voice steady. This is for my people. With a final thrust, she ended it. Silence fell. The Emperor's body crumpled, and for a moment, no one moved. Then Magnus let out a triumphant roar, and the tide shifted. The palace guards, witnessing the ruler's fall, surrendered. The city, the empire, belonged to Seraphina once more. As the sun rose, Seraphina stood on the balcony of the palace, looking over the people who had suffered under tyranny. Varen stood beside her, his expression unreadable. You have your throne, he said. What will you do with it? She turned to him, her eyes steady. Rebuild. Make things right. He studied her for a moment before nodding. Then let's begin. The people cheered below as Seraphina raised her sword high. The war was over. The queen had returned.